Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today for testimony on the need to protect Americans' privacy and AI as an accelerant to the urgency of passing such legislation. I want to welcome Dr. Ryan Cantwell, University of Washington School of Law and co-director of the University of Washington Technology Lab, Ms. Amber Kack, co-executive director of the AI Now Institute in New York, Mr. Abhav Tawari, global product policy for Mozilla San Francisco, and Mr. Morgan Reed, president of ACT, the App Association of Washington, D.C. So thank you all for being here for this very, very important hearing. We are here today to talk about the need to protect Americans' privacy and why AI is an accelerant that meets the needs of us passing legislation soon. Americans' privacy is under attack. We are being surveilled. Wow, I'm being tracked. We are being surveilled, tracked online in the real world through connected devices. And now, when you add AI, it's like putting fuel on a campfire in the middle of a windstorm. For example, a Seattle man's car insurance increased by 21% because his Chevy Bolt was collecting detailed information about his driving habits and sharing it with data brokers, who then shared it with his insurance company. The man never knew the car was collecting the data. Data about our military members, including contact information and health conditions, is already available for sale by data brokers for as little as 12 cents. Researchers at Duke University were able to buy such data sets for thousands of our active military personnel. Every year, Americans make millions of calls, texts, chats to crisis lines seeking help when they are in mental distress. You would expect this information would be kept confidential, but a nonprofit suicide crisis line was sharing data from those conversations with its for-profit affiliates that it was using to train its AI product. Just this year, the FTC sued a mobile app developer for tracking consumers' precise location through software it embedded in the grocery list and shopping rewards app. The company used this data to sort consumers into precise audience segments. Consumers whose use of this app helped them remember when to buy peanut butter, didn't expect to be profiled and categorized into a precise audience segment like, quote, parents of preschoolers. These privacy abuses and millions of others that are happening every day are bad enough, but now AI is an accelerant, and they're the reason why we need to help in speeding up our privacy law. AI is built on data, lots of it. Tech companies can't get enough to train their AI models, your shopping habits, your favorite videos, who your kids' friends are, all of that. And we're going to hear testimony today from Professor Cantwell about this issue, about how AI gives the capacity to derive sensitive insights about individuals. So it is not just the data that is being collected, it is the ability to have sensitive insights about individuals into the system. This, as some people have said, you're referring to your testimony now, is creating an inference economy that could become very challenging. That is why I think you also point out, Dr. Cantwell, that a privacy law helps offset the power of these corporations and why we need to act. I also want to thank Ms. Kack for her testimony, because she is clearly talking about that same corporate power and the unfair and deceptive practices, which we've already given to the FTC as their main authority, but the lack of transparency about what is going on with prompts and the AI synergy is that people are no longer just taking personal data and sending us cookie ads. They are taking that and putting it actually into prompt information. This is a very challenging situation, and I think your question is, are we going to allow our personal data to train AI models, is a very important question for our hearing today. We know that they want this data to feed their AI models to make the most amount of money. These incentives are really a race to the bottom, where most privacy-protected companies are at a competitive disadvantage. Researchers project that if current trends continue, companies training large language models may run out of new publicly available high-quality data to train AI systems as early as 2026. So without a strong privacy law, when the public data runs out, nothing stopping it from using our private data, I am very concerned that the ability of AI to collect vast amounts of personal data about individuals and create inferences about them quickly at very low cost can be used in harmful ways, like charging consumers different prices for the same product. I talked to a young developer in my state. I said, what is going on? And he said, well, I know one country is using AI to basically give it to their businesses. I said, well, why would they do that? Well, because they want to know when a person calls up for a reservation at a restaurant, how much income they really have. If they don't really have enough money to buy a bottle of wine, they're giving the reservation to someone else. So the notion is that discriminatory practices can already exist with just a little amount of data for consumers. AI in the wrong hands is also, though, a weapon. Deep fake phone scams are already plaguing my state. Scammers used AI to clone voices to defraud consumers by posing as a loved one in need of money. These systems can recreate a person's voice in just minutes, taking the familiar grandparent scam and putting it on steroids. More alarming, earlier this month, the Director of National Intelligence reported that Russian influence actors are planning to covertly use social media to subvert our elections. The ODNI called AI, quote, a maligned influence accelerant, end quote, saying that it was being used to more convincingly tailor video and other content ahead of the November election. Just 2 days ago, the Department of Justice reported that it dismantled a Russian bot farm intended to sow discord in the United States. Using AI, Russian created scores of fictitious user profiles on X and generated posts, and then used those bots to repost like comments on the post, further amplifying the original fake post. So this was possible at tremendous scale given AI. I'm not saying that misinformation might have not existed before and may not have been placed in a chat group, but now with the use of bots and AI accelerant, that information can be more broadly disseminated very, very quickly. So privacy is not a partisan issue. According to the Pew Research, majority of Americans across the political spectrum want more support for regulation. I believe our most important private data should not be bought or sold without our approval, and tech companies should serve and make sure that they implement these laws and help stop this kind of interference. The legislation that Representative McMorris-Rodgers and I have worked on, I think does just that. And I want to say I very much appreciate this morning legislation that Senator Blackburn and I will be introducing called the Copy Act, which provide much needed transparency around AI-generated content. The Copy Act will also put creators, including local journalists, artists, and musicians, back in control of their content with a watermark process that I think is very much needed. I'll now turn to the ranking member, Senator Cruz, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. American prosperity depends upon entrepreneurs. These are ambitious and optimistic men and women who are willing to take risks, pursue their dreams, and try to change the world. They mortgage their own homes, they put everything on the line to build a business that fills an unmet need or does something better than what's offered today. But throughout history, prosperity and human flourishing has been stymied or delayed by governments that impose regulatory policies to address supposed harms, but in actuality overstated risk in order to protect incumbent operators, often large and powerful companies that didn't want to compete and that just happened to give big campaign checks to the politicians in power. The United States has mostly chosen a different path, one where a free enterprise system governed by the rule of law allows Americans to freely pursue their ideas, grow their own businesses, and compete without having to obtain permission from all-knowing bureaucrats. Today's hearing on data privacy and artificial intelligence is a debate about which regulatory path we will take. Do we embrace our proven history, one with entrepreneurial freedom and technological innovation, or will we adopt the European model, where government technocrats get to second-guess and manage perceived risks with economic activity, ultimately creating an environment where only big tech with its armies of lawyers and lobbyists exist? Consider this. In 1993, at the dawn of the tech age, the economies of the United States and the European Union were roughly equal in size. Today, the American economy is nearly 50% larger than the EU's. The tech boom happened in America in part because Congress and the Clinton administration deliberately took a hands-off approach to the nascent internet. The result was millions of jobs and a much higher standard of living for Americans. Unfortunately, the Biden administration and many of my colleagues are suggesting the European model for AI, based heavily on hysterical doomsday prophecies to justify a command and control federal regulatory scheme that will cause the United States to lose our technological edge over China. The Biden administration's AI executive actions, as well as many of the AI legislative proposals, call for a new regulatory order that protects giant incumbent operators and discourages innovation with supposedly optional best practices or guidance written by all-knowing bureaucrats, some of whom were recently employed by the same big tech firms they seek to regulate, and some of whom hope to be employed again by those same big tech firms right after they write the rules that benefit those giant big tech firms. We already see federal AI regulators and Biden allies talking about the need to stop, quote, bias, quote, misinformation, quote, discrimination in AI systems and algorithms. That's code for speech police. If they don't like what you say, they want to silence it. Now, AI can certainly be used for nefarious purposes, just like any other technology. But to address specific harms or issues, we should craft appropriate and targeted responses. For example, Senator Klobuchar and I have introduced the bipartisan Take It Down Act, which targets bad actors who use AI to create and publish fake, lifelike, explicit images of real people. Our bill, which is sponsored by many Republican and Democrat members of this committee, would also require big tech to follow a notice and takedown process so ordinary Americans who are victimized by these disturbing images can get them offline immediately. The Bipartisan Take It Down Act is a tailored solution to a real problem. On behalf of the teenage girls and others who've been victimized by deep fake explicit imagery, I hope that this committee will take up soon the Take It Down Act and pass it and move it to the floor and get it signed into law. As I conclude, I'd like to address a related matter, the American Privacy Rights Act, APRA. I support Congress, not the FTC or any federal agency, but Congress setting a nationwide data privacy standard. Not only is it good for Americans to be empowered with privacy protections, but it's good for American businesses that desperately need legal certainty given the increasingly complex patchwork of state laws. But our goal shouldn't be to pass any uniform privacy standard, but rather the right standard that protects privacy without preventing U.S. technological innovation. I've discussed APRA with Chairwoman McMorris-Rodgers and will continue my offer to work with her. But right now, this bill is not the solution. It delegates far too much power to unelected commissioners at the FTC. It focuses on algorithmic regulations under the guise of civil rights, which would directly empower the DEI speech police efforts underway at the Biden White House, harming the free speech rights of all Americans. As currently constructed, APRA is more about federal regulatory control of the internet than personal privacy. In the end, it's the giant companies with vast resources that ultimately benefit from bills like APRA at the expense of small businesses. The path that Congress needs to take is to put individuals in control of the privacy of their own data and give them transparency to make decisions in the marketplace. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to do exactly that.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. We'll now turn to our panel, starting with Dr. Callow. Thank you so much. We're really proud of the work that the University of Washington has done. I think we're on both. Senator Cruz is mentioning the innovation economy. I think we have that down in the Northwest, but we also want to make sure we have down the important protections that go along with it. So thank you, Dr. Callow, for your presence.
Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my research and views on this important topic. I'm a law professor and information scientist at the University of Washington, where I co-founded the Tech Policy Lab and Center for an Informed Public. The views I express today are entirely my own. Americans are not receiving—
Dr. Callow, could you just bring that microphone a little closer to you?
Of course.
Thank you.
Americans are not receiving the privacy protections they demand or deserve. Not when Cambridge Analytica tricked them into revealing personal details of 87 million people through a poorly vetted Facebook app. Not when car companies shared their driving habits with insurance companies without their consent, sometimes leading to higher premiums, as the senator mentioned. Privacy rules are long overdue, but the acceleration of artificial intelligence in recent years threatens to turn a bad situation into a dire one. AI exacerbates consumer privacy concerns in at least 3 ways. First, AI fuels an insatiable demand for consumer data. Sources of data include what is available online, which incentivizes companies to scour and scrape every corner of the internet, as well as the company's own internal data, which incentivizes them to collect as much data as possible and store it indefinitely. AI's insatiable appetite for data alone deeply exacerbates the American consumer privacy crisis. Second, AI is increasingly able to derive the intimate from the available. Many AI techniques boil down to recognizing patterns in large data sets. Even so-called generative AI works by guessing the next word, pixel, or sound in order to produce new text, art, or music. Companies increasingly leverage this capability of AI to derive sensitive insights about individual consumers from seemingly innocuous information. The famous detective Sherlock Holmes, with the power to deduce whodunit by observing a string of facts most people would overlook as irrelevant, is the stuff of literary fiction. But companies really can determine who is pregnant based on subtle changes to their shopping habits, as Target reportedly did in 2012. And finally, AI deepens the asymmetries of information and power between consumers and companies that consumer protection law exists to arrest. The American consumer is a mediated consumer. We increasingly work, play, and shop through digital technology. And a mediated consumer is a vulnerable one. Our market choices, what we see, choose, and click, are increasingly scripted and arranged in advance. Companies have an incentive to use what they know about individual and collective psychology, plus the power of design, to extract as much money and attention as they can from everyone else. The question is not whether America should have rules governing privacy. The question is why we still do not. Few believe that the internet, social media, or AI are ideal as configured. A recent survey by the Pew Research Center suggests that an astonishing 81% of Americans assume that companies will use AI in ways for which they are not comfortable. 81%. Just for context, something between 30 and 40% of Americans identify as Taylor Swift fans. Meanwhile, the EU among our largest trading partners, refuses to certify America as adequate on privacy and does not allow consumer data to flow freely between our economies. What is the point of American innovation if no one trusts our inventions? More and more individual states, from California to Colorado, Texas to Washington, are passing privacy or AI laws to address their residents' concerns. Congress can and should look to such laws as a model. Yet it would be unwise to leave privacy legislation entirely to the states. The internet, social media, and AI are global phenomena. They do not respect state boundaries. And the prospect that some states will pass privacy rules is small comfort to the millions of Americans who reside in states that have not. Congress should pass comprehensive privacy legislation that protects American consumers, reassures our trading partners, and gives clear, achievable guidelines to industry. Data minimization rules, which obligate companies to limit the data they collect and maintain about consumers, could help address AI's insatiable appetites. Broader definitions of covered data could clarify that inferring sensitive information about consumers carries the same obligations as collecting it. And rules against data misuse could help address consumer vulnerability in the face of a growing asymmetry. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee. I look forward to a robust discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Callow. Ms. Kack, thank you so much. Welcome. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Cruz, and esteemed members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. We're at a very clear inflection point in the trajectory of AI. Without guardrails to set the rules of the road, we're committing ourselves to more of the same, to carrying forward extractive, invasive, and often predatory data practices and business models that have characterized the past decade of the tech industry. We are also committing ourselves to the seamless transition of big tech from surveillance monopolies to AI monopolies. A federal data privacy law could break this cycle, especially one with strong data minimization, which could challenge the culture of impunity and recklessness in the AI industry that's already hurting both consumers and competition. If there's a single point I want to make in today's testimony, it is that now is the moment when passing such a law actually matters before the trajectory has been set. Data privacy regulation is AI regulation, and it provides many of the tools that we need to protect the public from harm. But let's get concrete. How might the AI market shape up differently in the presence of a strong data privacy law? First, with data minimization rules, firms would need to put reason in place of recklessness when it comes to decisions about what data to collect, the purposes to which it can be used, and for how long it can be stored. These requirements would empower lawmakers, but also the public, to demand very basic accountability. So before Microsoft, for example, rushes to release its new Recall AI feature, which, by the way, takes continuous screenshots of everything you see or do on your computer, the company might need to ask itself and importantly document its answer. Does the utility of this feature outweigh the honeypot it's creating for bad actors? As a security researcher quickly discovered with Microsoft Recall, it's actually scarily trivial for an attacker to use malware to extract a record of everything you've ever viewed on your PC. Now, a strong data minimization mandate would have nipped this in the bud. It would have likely disincentivized the development of such a patently insecure feature to begin with. Second, we would have transparency about the data decisions that affect us all. Meta and Google recently announced updates, unilaterally of course, to their terms, which allow AI training from user data. Now, we know about this because European users were alerted by Meta. Without a legal mandate to require it, of course, American users received no such notification. And users of Reddit are also similarly up in arms because their content was just sold to the highest bidder, in this case, Google, for use of training its AI. But it's important to remember that a privacy law would offer much more than just transparency in every single instant I mentioned. Purpose limitation rules would prevent big tech from using AI as its catch-all justification to use and combine data across contexts and store it forever. The FTC has already penalized Amazon for storing the voice data of children indefinitely using AI as its excuse. but we can't rely on this kind of one-off enforcement. There needs to be rules of the road. And these moves, it's important to remember, would not just safeguard our privacy, they would also act as a powerful check on the data advantages currently being consolidated by big tech to build a moat around them and stave off competition in AI. Thirdly, in a world with a data privacy mandate, AI developers would need to make data choices that deliberately prevent discriminatory outcomes. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see, that women are seeing far less ads for high-paying jobs on Google Ads. That is 100% a feature of data decisions that have already been made upstream. The good news here is that these are avoidable problems, and it's not just in scope for a privacy law. I would say it is integral to protecting people from the most serious abuses of this data. And where specific AI practices have sort of inherent well-established harms, emotion recognition systems that have faulty scientific foundations or pernicious forms of ad targeting, the law would hold them entirely off limits. Finally, and here's the thing about very large-scale AI, it is not only computationally, ecologically, and data intensive, it's also very, very expensive to develop and run. Now, these eye-watering costs will need a path to profit, and by every account, a viable business model still does not exist. Now, it is precisely in this kind of an environment with a few incumbent firms feeling the pressure to turn a profit that predatory business models emerge. Meanwhile, we're hearing new research that LLM systems are capable of hyper-personalized inferences about us, even from the most general prompts. You do not need to be a clairvoyant to see that all roads might well be leading us right back to the surveillance advertising business model that got us here. So to conclude, there is nothing about the current trajectory of AI that is inevitable, and as a democracy, the US has a huge opportunity to take global leadership and shape this next era of tech so that it reflects the public interests and not just the bottom lines of very few companies. This is the moment for action. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keck. Thank you for that testimony. And the notion that in your testimony you talked about how just the sound of our voice could be used to project different detections and different outcomes of what people are doing is just very disturbing, very disturbing. So, Mr. Tiwari, welcome.
Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Cruz, and esteemed members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the critical issue of protecting Americans' privacy in the age of artificial intelligence. My name is Udbhav Tiwari, and I'm the Director of Global Product Policy at Mozilla. Today, I will discuss the urgent need for comprehensive privacy legislation, the importance of data minimization, and the role of privacy-enhancing technologies in fostering responsible AI development. At Mozilla, we approach tech policy issues from a unique vantage point. As a nonprofit foundation, an open source community, and a tech company, we build the open source Firefox web browser, Mozilla VPN, and products like Solo, an AI-powered website builder for micro SMBs and solopreneurs. These products are used by hundreds of millions of people around the world, and Mozilla's mission is to ensure that the internet is a global public resource, open and accessible to all. We believe that comprehensive privacy legislation is foundational to any AI framework, and that maintaining US leadership in AI requires America to lead on privacy and user rights. Privacy is a critical component of AI policy, not just because AI has the potential to accelerate privacy-related harms, but because AI systems thrive on data, and the drive to develop advanced AI models has also intensified the demand for vast amounts of personal information. This data collection, often done without the adequate consent or via deceptive choices, poses significant risks to individual privacy and security. By championing policies that promote innovation, create clear rules of the road for companies, and protect fundamental user rights, we can create both a competitive and a level playing field for the American AI industry and prepare domestic champions for global leadership. At the core of these principles and policies should be data minimization. Data minimization is a crucial principle that ensures only the necessary data is collected and used for specific purposes. In the context of AI, data minimization can be achieved through several strategies, including informed consent and ensuring there is privacy by design. While legislation is essential, technical advances must work hand in hand with legislative solutions to create a more safe and private future. In the context of what the ecosystem currently needs, we need a significant investment in privacy-enhancing technologies to develop AI systems that respect and protect individual privacy. Openness and open source are also essential ingredients for improving verifiable and meaningful privacy in AI technologies. Open approaches play a vital role in promoting innovation and preventing the concentration of power in the hands of few companies that my fellow panelists have spoken about. They enable the economic benefit of AI to be more widely shared amongst businesses of different sizes and capabilities. This leads to increased investment and job creation. We also have clear evidence from open source development practices that openness allows for diverse input and collaboration, fostering the development of privacy-preserving techniques that can benefit everyone rather than relying on security through obscurity. Turning to the potential risks of AI amplifying privacy violations, we know that online manipulation, targeted scams, and online surveillance are not new risks in our digital lives. However, AI technologies can supercharge such harms, creating risks like profiling and manipulation, bias and discriminations, and deepfakes and identity misuse. To mitigate these risks, we need comprehensive federal privacy legislation. This should be accompanied by strong regulatory oversight and continued investments in privacy-enhancing technologies. We must also ensure that AI systems are transparent and accountable, with mechanisms in place to address privacy violations and provide recourse for affected individuals, underpinned by disclosure and accountability. When it comes to the AI's potential to impact civil liberties, the risk cannot be understated. The same technologies that drive innovation can also be used to infringe upon fundamental rights and be used by big tech companies to trample on individual privacy. It is therefore imperative that AI development and deployment are guided by principles that protect civil liberties. This includes safeguarding freedom of expression, preventing unlawful surveillance, and ensuring that AI systems do not perpetuate discrimination or bias. In conclusion, protecting Americans' privacy in the age of AI is a critical challenge that requires comprehensive legislation. As we navigate the complexities of AI and privacy, it is crucial to strike a balance between innovation and protection. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions and to working with you to protect Americans' privacy in the AI era.
Thank you, Mr. Tawari. Very much appreciate you being here. And Mr. Reed, thank you so much for being here. I'm not trying to ask you a question in advance, but I'm pretty sure you have thousands of members of your organization, and I'm pretty sure you have quite a few in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you for being here.
We do. Many in the great state of Washington. Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the committee, my name is Morgan Reed, President of ACT, the App Association, a trade association representing small and medium-sized app developers and connected device manufacturers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on two significant and linked subjects, privacy and AI. Let me say very clearly that the U.S. absolutely needs a federal privacy law. For years, we have supported the creation of a balanced bipartisan framework that gives consumers certain protections and businesses clear rules of the road. Instead, what we have now is a global array of mismatched and occasionally conflicting laws, including here in the U.S. with either 19 or 20, depending on who you ask, state-level comprehensive privacy laws, and more coming every year. To prevent this morass of confusion and paperwork, preemption must also be strong and without vague exceptions. And it must include small businesses so that customers can trust the data is being protected when they do business with a company of any size. Unfortunately, the American Privacy Rights Act, or APRA, falls short of both of these objectives. Carving out small businesses from the definition of covered entities, as APRA does, is a non-starter because it would deny us the benefits of Bill's preemption provisions. Instead, small business would be required to comply separately with 19 state laws and, more importantly, the not yet passed laws in 31 states, exposing us to costly state-by-state compliance and unreasonably high litigation costs. And it isn't just small tech impacted by this. In today's economy, everyone uses customers' data, even bricks and mortar. A local bike shop in Nevada likely has customers coming from Utah, Arizona, California, Colorado, and Idaho. An alert reminding these customers about a tire sale with free shipping or that it's time to get their bike in for a tune-up requires at least a passing familiarity with each state's small business carve-out. In the ultimate irony, APRA may even incent small businesses to sell customers' data in order to gain the benefit of preemption. Congress must instead move forward with a framework that incorporates small businesses and creates a path to compliance for them. And this acceptance of small businesses' role in the tech ecosystem becomes even more pronounced when we turn to AI. Mainstream media is all abuzz about big companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Apple moving into AI. But the reality is small business has been the faster adopter. More than 90% of my members use generative AI tools today, with an average 80% increase in productivity. And our members who develop those AI solutions are more nimble than larger rivals. We're developing, deploying, and adapting AI tools in weeks rather than months. Their experiences should play a major role in informing policymakers on how any new laws should apply to AI's development and use. Here are two examples of how our members are using AI in innovative ways. First up is our Iowa-based swine tech. It's reshaping the management of hog farms. Farmers use their product, PigFlow, that's really the name, to manage the entire process of using sensors to track the health of sows and piglets, and then market analytics and public information to build AI-powered holistic solutions. But as Paul Simon said, big and fat, pig's supposed to look like that. For our member Metric Mate in Atlanta, the goal is the opposite. This Atlanta-based startup uses a combination of off-the-shelf and custom fitness trackers to help individuals and physical therapists to track and refine fitness goals. AI helped Metric Mate respond to the progress being made over time and instantaneously, while their patented tap sensor gives the user the ability to track their workouts and seamlessly transmit data to the Metric Mate app. These examples show how AI is useful for innovative yet normal activities. So rather than limit AI as a whole, policymakers must target regulation to situations where a substantial risk of concrete harm exists. The risk of AI use on a pig farm should not be treated the same as risks in sectors like healthcare or wellness, and yet both of them might be covered by future laws. Finally, I want to stress the importance of standards to the future of AI. Standards are a valuable way for new innovators to make interoperable products that compete with the biggest market players. As the committee considers bills on the subject, we need NIST to remain a supporter rather than an arbiter of voluntary industry-led standards. The committee should also be aware of the threat to small business through standard essential patent abuse. With non-US based companies holding the crown for the most US patents every year, federal policy must combat abuse of patent licensing in standards by ensuring that licenses are available to any willing licensee, including small businesses, on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. If we're not capable of doing that, the next generation of AI standards will not be owned or run through US companies, but through those outside of the US with different perspectives on human rights and our expectations. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. And on that last point, we'll have you expand today or more generally for the record what we need to do about that last point. I definitely think in the past we have sided too much with the big companies on the patent side and not enough empowerment of the inventors, the smaller companies. So I want to make sure we get that part right in addition to your recommendations. You've made a couple of very good recommendations. Thank you. I'd like to go to a couple of charts here if we could. One, when we first started working on the privacy law, I'm going to direct this to you, Professor Callow, but what got me going was the transfer of wealth to online advertising. I don't think people really quite understood how much the television, newsprint, radio, magazine, the entire advertising revenue shift went online. Now we're just talking about the internet. Could you bring that a little closer, please? Get that up a little closer. So we are now at, we are now at 68%. I don't know if people can see that, but we're now at 68% of all spending, 2/3 of all spending of advertising has now taken place online with data and information. So that trend's just going to keep continuing. Now, you and I have had many conversations about the effect of that on the news media, having community voices. You know, our community in Seattle, King 5 or the Seattle Times couldn't exist if it had misinformation. It just wouldn't exist. But in the online world, you can have misinformation. There's no corrective force for that. But all the revenue is now gone to the online world. And the second chart describes, I think, a little bit about your testimony that I want to ask a question about, and that is the amount of information that is now being derived about you, that AI is this capacity to derive sensitive insights. So that trend that I just described, where 2/3 of all advertising revenue, I mean, somebody said data is like the new oil, right? It's just where everybody's going to go and make the money. So that's a lot of money already in that shift over those years that I mentioned on the chart. But now you're saying they're going to take that information and they're going to derive sensitive information about us. Ms. Kack said it's the way your voice sounds. You've described it as, you know, various features. So could you tell me how protecting us against that in the AI model, why that's so important? And, you know, I just want to point out, we're very proud of what the Allen Institute is doing on AI. We think we're the leaders in AI applications. We're very proud of that, both in healthcare, farming, energy. You know, we have an agreement today between the United States and Canada in principle on the Columbia River Treaty. I think, you know, water AI will be a big issue of the future. How do you manage your natural resources to the most effective possible use? So we're all big on the AI implications in the Pacific Northwest. But we're very worried about the capacity to derive sensitive insights. And then, as you mentioned, an insurance company or somebody using that information against you. Could you expound on that, please?
Absolutely. I was talking to my sister who's on the board of the Breast Cancer Alliance about my testimony, and she said, you know, Ryan, just make sure that people know how important it is for AI to be able to spot patterns in medical records to ensure that people get better treatment, for example, for breast cancer, right? And I agree with that, and I'm also proud of all the work we're doing at University of Washington and Allen. The problem is that the ability to derive sensitive insights is being used in ways that disadvantage consumers, and they're not able to figure out what's going on and fight back, right? So for example,
thereby driving up costs.
For example, right? I mean, you know, we know why everything costs $9.99, right? It's because your brain thinks of it as being a little bit further away from $10 than it really is. But the future we're headed to, and even the present, is a situation where you're charged exactly as much as you're willing to pay in the moment, right? Say I'm trying to make dinner for my kids, and I'm just, you know, desperately trying to find a movie for them to stream, you know, that they both can agree on, right? You know, if Amazon can figure that out, or Apple can figure that out, they can charge me more in the moment when I'm flustered and frustrated, because they can tell, right? And if that sounds far-fetched, Senator, Uber once experimented with whether or not people would be more willing to pay surge pricing when their batteries were really low on their phone, because they'd be desperate to catch a ride, right? Amazon itself has gotten into trouble for beginning to charge returning customers more because they know that they have you in their ecosystem. This is the world of using AI to extract consumer surplus, and it's not a good world, and it's one that data minimization could help address.
Senator Wicker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Reed, let me go to you. You've testified before on this topic. Where are most of the jobs created in the United States economy? What size business?
Right. So small businesses are the single largest source of new business of new jobs in the United States.
Okay, and so let's talk about how the current situation affects small and medium-sized businesses and how legislation would affect them positively or negatively. Let's pretend I am a small business owner in the state of Washington or the state of Mississippi, and I use the internet to sell products in multiple states. That would be a very typical situation, would it not?
Yes, in fact, one of the hardest things that I think has been transformative, but yet it's hard for legislatures to understand, is our smallest members are global actors. My smallest developers are selling products around the world and are developing a customer base around the world. And in many ways, you can think of it this way. Maybe there's 5,000 people in your hometown who want to buy your product, but there's 500,000 people who want to buy your product everywhere. So as a small business, the internet allows you to reach all of those customers. The problem with APRA carving out small business is all of the sudden now, a small business that wants to grow from 10,000 customers in the great state of Mississippi to 500,000 customers throughout the United States.
Okay. So we
has to comply.
The law needs to apply evenly.
Correct.
To all actors. Let's talk about preemption. If I'm this small business person in the state of Washington, and Congress passes a new data privacy law, but the preemption clause has enumerated exceptions for various reasons, how's that going to affect me?
Once again, the people who are best equipped to deal with complex compliance regimes are very large companies that hire large numbers of lawyers. So we really need a compliance regime and a preemption regime that's easy to understand and is applicable when my businesses don't have a compliance team. Heck, they don't even have a compliance officer. It's probably the chief dishwasher is also the chief compliance officer. And I think that's an important thing to understand about small businesses, is they don't have teams of lawyers.
How about the private, a broad private right of action? How is that going to affect me and my business?
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring it up. When I testified before you on this same topic, we had great discussions about the fact that there may be needs occasionally for private right of action, but they should be limited in scope. And I think that's more true now than ever before. If we have a privacy regime that exposes small business and everyone else to individual private right of action from multiple states, it sets up small businesses to be the best victim for sue and settle. Nobody wants to go to war with Microsoft, but I can send you, a small business, a pay me now note for $50K. I'm gonna go to my local small town lawyer, I'm gonna say, can you fight this? He's gonna say it's gonna be $150,000 to fight it. So you're gonna stroke a check and you're gonna not pay an employee or not hire someone for $50K. So we want to avoid a private right of action that leads to the ability for unscrupulous lawyers to make a killing off of sue and settle, particularly in small businesses where the cost of fighting is greater than the cost of the check they're asking for.
Okay, you know, we're going to run out of time real quick, but Mr. Callow, on page 6 of your testimony, you say expecting tech companies to comply with a patchwork of laws, and that would be small and large tech companies. A patchwork of laws, depending on what state a consumer happens to access their services, is unrealistic and wasteful. I hear people say this, let's pass a nationwide Data Privacy Act, but if a state like California wants to really, really protect even better, let's let them do so. Let's give states like that an option out ability. Doesn't that start the patchwork all over again?
Senator, it's an excellent question. My view is that in a perfect world, the federal government would set a floor, and then the individual states, if they wanted to be more protective of their own residents, right, would be able to raise that floor for their own citizens, right? In this particular context, it is very difficult to deploy these large global systems in ways that differentiate depending on what state you're in.
Okay, right? And I'm sorry I have to go. Mr. Reed, that's getting back to the patchwork, isn't it? So now you gotta comply with two. And then who's gonna decide which is more protective?
Absolutely. That's it in a nutshell. Trying to figure out what those are.
I think Mr. Callow just said it's not realistic to have the patchwork. I think his testimony is quite clear. He says you have to have a federal preemption. Yes, it does. I do. I think it does. And I think Mr. Reed, I think
Well,
you're.
okay, well, Madam Chair, since there are not dozens of us, but only a
Senator
couple.
we have one of our colleagues who's waiting, Senator Rosen, who actually has coded before, so I feel like we need to defer to her. So, Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you. You know, writing that computer code, it was a great experience, a great living, and I loved every minute of it. Now it prepares me for a lot of things I do here today. So thank you for holding this hearing. These issues are so important. I really appreciate the witnesses. I'm going to talk first a little bit about AI scams because Americans are generating more data online than ever before. And we know with advances in AI, data can be used in many ways, depending on the algorithms that are written. And of course, bad actors are going to use AI to generate more believable scams using the deep fake, cloning, and all the pictures. You've seen it. Everyone has seen it everywhere. And these particularly target our seniors and they target our veterans. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Cack and Professor Callow, both of you, how can enacting a federal data privacy law better protect individuals from these AI-enabled cyber attacks and scams that we know are happening every single day in every community?
Thank you,
Ms. Cack,
Senator.
we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Professor.
Thank you, Senator. It's interesting because when ChatGPT was released and there was all of this excitement about whether we were one step, who knows if it's tomorrow or in 50 years, but one step away from these sort of fantastical Terminator-like scenarios, what we were really more concerned about was, had we just seen the creation of the most effective spam generator that history had ever seen? And so I think what is at the heart of these issues is that we are creating these technologies, they are moving to market clearly before they're ready for commercial release, and they're sort of unleashing these diffused harms, including, as you mentioned, the risk of sort of exacerbating concerns of deceptive and spam content. To your question on how would a federal data privacy law sort of nip these kinds of problems in the bud, I think it would do so in a very sort of structural sense. It would say that there need to be certain rules of the road, there need to be limits on what companies are able to collect, the ways in which they're training their models, so that these companies are not creating inaccurate, sort of misleading AI tools, which are then being integrated into our most sort of sensitive social domains, whether that's banking or healthcare or hiring. So I think the sort of final thing I'll say on the kind of spam generation point is that we have known for the last decade, we have evidence like garbage in, garbage out. So when we see these failures, we should see them not as output failures, but as failures that go back to very crucial data decisions that are made right from the training and development stage of these models all the way through to the output stage. And so the privacy risks.
Thank you. Thank you. I only have a few minutes.
Cycle.
So Professor Callow, if you could be really brief, because I want to get to a question about data ownership. Who owns your data and who has a right to your data? So if you'd be really brief so I could get that question in, I'd surely appreciate it.
I think that we need to empower federal regulators such as the Federal Trade Commission to go after all kinds of abuses that involve artificial intelligence, including such scams. Investing in the FTC and its expertise is the correct call, in my opinion.
Thank you. I appreciate that because I want to talk about something that everyone talks to me about is data ownership. AI transparency, because Nevadans today, people across this country, do not have the right to access, correct, or delete their data. Who owns your data? What do they do with it? How do they use it? It matters to people. And so it's impossible for many to even understand, like I said, who holds their data and what they're going to do with it. So the supply chain of consumer data, it is full of loopholes. Whereas third-party resellers, they can just sell your data to the highest bidder. So Mr. Tiwari, can transparent AI systems exist without strong federal privacy regulations, including consumer control over your own personal data?
Thank you, Senator. And in short, the answer is no. It is impossible for users to be able to effectively exercise the rights that they have, not only over their own data, but also their social experiences, without knowing what companies are collecting, how that data is being used, and more importantly, what rights do they have if that harm is occurring in the real world. We've already in this hearing so far discussed various examples of harms that we have seen occur in the real world, but yet the actions that regulators and governments have been able to take to limit some of those harms have been constrained by the lack of effective and comprehensive federal privacy legislation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Madam Chair, I'm going to yield back with 8 seconds to go.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. I am so delighted we're doing this hearing today. And as we have talked so many times, when I was in the House and our Senate colleague Peter Welch was in the House, we took steps and introduced the first legislation to make businesses take steps to protect the security of our data, to require data breach notifications, and allow the FTC and the state attorneys general to hold companies accountable for violations. And as Senator Rosen just said, it is so vitally important to know who owns the virtual you, who has that, and what are they doing with it. And now, as we're looking at AI, I think federal privacy legislation is more important than ever, because you've got to put that foundational legislation in place in order to be able to legislate to a privacy standard. And that is why we're working so carefully on 2 pieces of legislation: the No Fakes Act that Senator Kuhn, Klobuchar, Tillis, and I are working on to protect the voice and visual likeness of individuals from unauthorized use by generative AI. And then, Madam Chairman, you've mentioned the Copied Act that you and I are working on, which would require consent to use material with content provenance to train AI systems. And I want to come to each of you, and let's just go down the dais as we're looking at this. We're talking about ways that I'd like to hear from you all very quickly. Ways that Congress is going to be limited in legislating if we do not have a privacy standard. And then how do we find the balance between that privacy and data security component so that people know they have the firewalls to protect their information and keep it from being used by open source and large language models. So let's just run down the dais on this.
Thank you, Senator. I was really struck in my research for this hearing by the Pew Center's research. Their survey suggests that overwhelming percentages of Americans are worried that their data is out there and is going to be used in ways that is concerning and surprising to them. You know, I think without passing laws that, per Senator Cantwell's remarks, define sensitive information to cover not merely already sensitive information like health status, but cover the inferences that can be made on top of that data, Americans are not going to feel comfortable and safe. I think that security and privacy go hand in hand. We could sit here and talk about the myriad horrible data breaches that have been occurring across our country. We can talk about ransomware and the way that hospital systems are being shut down. But ultimately, you know, it's all boils down to the fact that the American consumer is vulnerable, and it needs its government to step in and set some clear rules.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'll say that the sort of incentives for irresponsible data surveillance have existed for the last decade. What AI does is it pours gasoline on these incentives. So if anything, we have a situation where all of our known privacy and security harms and risks are getting exacerbated. To the second part of your question, which is what is the connection between privacy and security, I would say those are sort of two sides of the same coin. So data never collected is data that is never at risk, and data that is deleted after it is no longer needed is also data that is no longer at risk. So I think having a strong data minimization mandate that puts what we would consider very basic data hygiene in place is absolutely essential, especially as you're seeing more kind of concerning bad actors use this information in nefarious ways, some of which the legislation you mentioned is going to clamp down on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mozilla is an organization that has hundreds of millions of people that use its products because of its privacy properties. Without providing a consistent standard that allows American companies to compete globally, just like they do on innovation, but also on privacy, the Congress will be unable to ensure that Americans not only get the privacy rights they deserve, but also that American companies can have a high baseline standard with which they can compete with organizations around the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I understand I'm over time here, but very quickly, privacy laws should have a data security provision. It's one of our 4 Ps of privacy. I think data hygiene is absolutely critical, but it's different than a prohibition on processing. So let's be careful on how we use the term data hygiene rather than no collection at all. So let's be smart about how we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership on the Copy Act. I think your understanding of creators, artists, and musicians and being able to stick up for them has been really critical, so thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. State privacy laws and federal proposals agree that consumers should have more control, over their personal data, including the right to have their data deleted, as has been pointed out. However, consumers really don't have the time or the expertise to go down and effectively manage all their data online, to fill out the forms, to, cookie notices or these lengthy privacy agreements become more of a distraction. So, Mr. Callow, let's start with you. The American Privacy Rights Act proposes, as has been discussed, minimizing personal data collection, but in addition, offering consumer-facing controls like data deletion requests. And how do these two approaches work in tandem to protect consumers rather than anyone alone?
That's a great question. In other contexts where we're trying to protect consumers, we do give them information and choices. And we know that privacy preferences are not completely homogeneous. However, in other contexts, not only do we give people choice, for example, how much fat content do they want in their milk, but we also place substantive limits, like there can't be so much arsenic, And so I think that needs to be a combination of both. People should have control over their data, and they should be asked before that data is used in a separate context, like to set their insurance premiums. But there also have to be baseline rules, because as you point out, consumers do not have the time or the wherewithal to police the market and protect themselves all on their own.
Right, good answer. And Ms. Keck, you can opine on that as well, but I've got another question. So let me start with the question. And you guys have discussed a little bit the advances in generative and traditional AI, and how those advances really are fueled by data now. I mean, we recognize that, but training AI systems can't be, it really can't be at the expense of people's privacy. And reducing the amount of personal and sensitive data, as you have all discussed, the notion of minimization does really reduce the likelihood that data privacy and data security harm could happen. And Senator Blackburn, among all the other bills she listed, these issues are covered extensively in various hearings we've had on our subcommittee that she and I chair, Consumer Protection, Product Safety, and Data Security. So, Ms. Keck, I wanted to say, how would you quantify, how often or what types of quantification do you say when you say how often is the data of consumers unnecessarily exposed within the AI model? And do you believe that the strict data minimization requirements can significantly help control this, let's call it data leakage?
Senator, there are two parts, two ways in which I'll answer that question. The first is to say we don't know, and that's sort of part of why we're here today, which is that we don't have basic transparency about whether our data is being used, how it's being protected. And what we do know is that companies like Meta and Google are sort of at will changing their terms of service to say, you know, heads up, we're now using your data for AI. At the same time as we're seeing these chatbots routinely leak the personal information they were trained on. But I think if we did, you know, in the absence of clear data from these companies and a regulatory mandate that allows us to ask them for it, I think what we can already see just from the most obvious lapses is that this irresponsible data collection and use is happening everywhere. It's happening all the time. And I think one of the ways in which the US might benefit from being somewhat of a laggard when it comes to data privacy law is to look at what hasn't worked elsewhere. What hasn't worked is a consent-only based regime. That's why we need accountability in addition to consent. What has worked is that the Brazilian data protection regulator recently banned Meta from using user data to train their AI because they found that there was children's images in the training data and it was being leaked on the other side, right? So there's a lot to learn and there's a lot of, I think, a foundation from which to act from. Great.
And Mr. Tawari, just quickly, the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR of the European Union, has been in effect since 2018, I guess, 2019, 2018. Since then, it's been amended. They're still sorting it out, I think, in terms of governance structure. Without a U.S. data privacy law, how can we have some leadership on the global stage on these issues?
Thank you, Senator. By most counts, there are currently at least 140 countries around the world that have a national federal privacy law. By not having a privacy law, the United States of America is not allowing its companies to be able to effectively compete with the companies from these countries. And that's because privacy is now a competitive differentiator. Like I mentioned earlier, people use the Firefox product because they believe in the privacy properties of the Firefox product. And without a baseline of such standards, the small and medium companies that we've been talking about will be unable to compete with other small and medium companies around the world.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you. Senator Moran.
Chairwoman, thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists. A very important hearing. Thank you for holding it. Passage of federal data privacy legislation is long overdue. I chaired the subcommittee on data privacy that Senator Hickenlooper now chairs, and Senator Blackburn is the ranking member. Senator Blumenthal was the ranking member. We have come so close so many times, but never just quite across the finish line, and the problems and challenges with our lack of success continue to mount. And it gets, I don't know that the issues get more difficult to resolve, but we still haven't found the will to overcome kind of the differences of the things that each of us think is pretty important. I reintroduced my comprehensive data privacy, Consumer Data Privacy and Security Act, again in this Congress. Gives Americans control over their own data, establishes a single clear federal standard for data privacy, and provides for robust enforcement of data privacy protections that does not lead to frivolous legal actions that would harm small business. I think these are common sense policies, and again, I think there's a path forward utilizing those, and I would again say in this hearing, as I've said numerous times over the years, I'm willing to work with any and all to try to find that path forward. I have a few questions for the panel. I think I start with you, Mr. Reed. Important that data privacy requirements, in my view, established by federal law are shared by consumer-facing entities, service providers, and third parties, all of which may collect or process consumer data. Exempting segments of this value chain from requirements or enforcement under the data privacy law, I think, places an unfair burden on consumer-facing entities, including particularly small business. Mr. Reed, is that something you agree with? When it comes to data privacy, regulatory burden should be shared across each entity that collects or processes data?
I do, but I want to be careful about one thing. I don't want to, I know this sounds weird coming from the business side, so to speak, but I want to be careful that we don't say that shared responsibility becomes everybody touching their nose and saying, I'm not it. So I think the point at which you give your data over, the point at which you have that first contact, whether it's my members through an application or through a store that you visit, is the most logical point for the consumer to begin to say, hey, I want my data to be retrieved, or I don't want my data used in this way. So I think, yes, there is shared responsibility across the chain, but I don't want a situation where the front person who interacts with the customer can then say, hey, that's down the food chain, 3 third parties from there.
And
So
you
I think
avoid
that's
that-
important.
You avoid that by?
Well, you avoid that by actually having a clear and concrete conversation, so to speak, with the customer when they provide the data. Here's what you're getting in exchange, here's what the rules of the road are, and that's why a federal comprehensive privacy bill, and we appreciate the bill that you've worked on already on data, moves us in a direction of having consumers nationally have an understanding of what their rights and what our responsibilities are with their data. So absolutely, but it has to start with an understanding at the first place and then the shared responsibility throughout the chain.
One more for you, Mr. Reed. 19 states, I think, is the number that have passed their own data privacy laws. It's a patchwork of state data privacy laws increasing compliance costs. One estimate projects a compliance cost for business could reach $239 billion annually if Congress does not implement its a data privacy law. Incidentally, I came to Congress believing and still believe that government closest to home is better than government far away, but it seems like I spend a bunch of my time trying to figure out how we take care of a complex situation with 50 different states and 50 different standards. Kansas doesn't have a data privacy law, but borders 2 states that do.
Exactly.
Would you describe the challenges for small business associated with working in states with different data privacy standards?
Well, your state is one of the ones in particular that we find most interesting because you literally have businesses in your state that have a primary number of their customers are actually from the bordering state because you have that crossroads that exist. So for Kansas and Oklahoma, you have customers that cross the border literally every day. So having a mixture of these privacy bills, now to be clear, a lot of states have some sort of small business carve out, but it's different and the definitions are different in every state. So any business that participates is going to have to figure out who's going to tell them what they do, and if that customer walks in and says, my zip code is this, oh, sorry, I have to treat your data this way. If it's this, then I have to do it another way. It is soul-crushing for a small business to have to interview each purchaser and ask them what county they live in or what state they live in. So it's a huge burden on small business, and unfortunately, it's one that's really a lot easier for a multinational company to handle.
Let me quickly ask Mr. Tuari and Ms. Kack. It's important for Americans to understand when their data is collected and processed by companies. This belief is reflected in our data privacy legislation, which requires covered entities to publish their privacy policies in easy-to-understand language and to provide easy-to-use means to exercise their right to control over data. How can a federal policy ensure consumers are aware of their data is being used, even as AI potentially increases the complexity of how consumer data is processed?
Thank you, Senator. It is essential for us to recognize that purely relying on consent has proven to be ineffective to protect the privacy of the average consumer. Technology has now become such a complex endeavor that to expect an average consumer to understand everything that can happen when their data is collected is a burden that they will never be able to meaningfully fulfill. And therefore, any effective federal privacy legislation must include accountability measures that also place obligations upon these entities for what they cannot do, regardless of whether the consumer has consented to that behavior or not. Only then can consumers be sure that the government is working effectively to protect their privacy rather than hoping that they understand everything that may happen to their data.
It's a sad state of affairs, actually. We can't understand it well enough to protect ourselves. Anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Senator, is sort of what do we do as consumers with that information? And that's really why transparency isn't enough and why proposals like the bipartisan ADPPA and the APRA are so important because they're putting down sort of rules of the road that apply regardless of consent and what consumers choose.
Thank you both.
Yes, I think Senator Budd.
Thank you, Chairman.
So thank you all for being here. Technological leadership is foundational to American dominance in the 21st century. In this country, we innovate, create products and services that consumers want, which increase productivity and it sharpens competition. This spurs a positive cycle of further innovation. And, the internet's a perfect example of that. And one of the factors that differentiates America, it's a regulatory environment that protects public interest and safety, while at the same time giving talented entrepreneurs and specialists the space to try new things. I think that AI should follow this tried and this true path. But Mr. Reed, thanks again to all of you for being here. Mr. Reed, thank you for your opening example a few moments back in your opening comments about hog farms. Being from North Carolina, I really appreciate that. And makes me only wish I'd have had a little more bacon for breakfast. So,
Always a good call.
That's right. Well, in your testimony, you talked about the different ways that App Association members are creating and deploying AI tools. In fact, you said that 75% of surveyed members report using generative AI. Do you believe that there is currently a healthy amount of competition in this space?
Well, I think what's been most amazing is the level of competition against bigger players is profound. The news is always covering Microsoft's moves and Meta's moves and other players' moves. But I'm telling you right now that we're seeing more moves by small and medium-sized companies to use AI in important ways. And one quick and critical example, if you've got a small construction business in a town, right now to bid on an RFP that gets let, it's a lot of nights of coffee and desperate typing on your computer to try to get one RFP out. But if I can look at all of your RFPs with AI, look at what you do best, what you claim you do best, and help you write that RFP so that instead of filing one, you file 10. Maybe you win 2 bids. Now you hire 3 people. I used your own data. A lot of my panelists are talking about using consumer data and sucking in consumer data. What my members are doing with a lot of this is actually using your private data stores to look at what you're doing well and help you improve upon it. And I think when we talk about AI and privacy, we have to remember that the ability to do something like that, simply help you write 10 RFPs, is a huge advantage that AI provides. And it's something, frankly, small businesses are doing better than the large businesses right now.
I appreciate that example, especially the advantages for small businesses. I read about 4 newsletters a day on this very topic, so I'm fascinated with it. The question, Mr. Reed, is about the FTC's antitrust policy that seems to be focused against vertical integration, and we think it may have a chilling effect on your members' ability to develop and roll out new and better AI services. Even with some of the bigs we see, like with OpenAI, of course, people read news about that every day, but Microsoft and Apple not even having a board presence there. I don't know if that's fear against antitrust legislation or what, but we see that there's potentially a chilling effect. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, unfortunately, the Federal Trade Commission's proposed rule on Hart-Scott-Rodino is terrible. It's just, I probably should use better words here in the committee, but it really puts small businesses at a huge disadvantage because it essentially establishes a floor for the potential for an acquisition. And what that does for small AI companies that are trying to figure out how to make their way in the world is to seek venture capital. Venture capital, or even your parents, they have to believe in your dream. And part of that dream is that you can have a huge success. When venture capitalists are putting money in, they're looking at a portfolio, and they know 9 out of 10 are going to fail. But if the FTC is essentially saying that they're capping at $119 million anybody's success level, then that tells the venture capitalists to change the 9 companies they're investing in because they can't dream bigger than $119 million. We also think that the Hart-Scott-Rodino proposal as put forth violates the Reg Flex Act because they actually didn't take into consideration the impact on small and medium-sized businesses. So yes, it has a huge impact on competition for small, new AI startups, and we're incredibly disappointed, and we look forward to seeing if we can convince the FTC to do the right thing and change their way.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. Back to your comments on small business. I don't know if that weighs into your answer on the next question, Mr. Reed, but how should this committee weigh the need for firms to be able to use responsibly collected consumer data with the serious concerns that consumers have about the fact that their sensitive data may be breached or improperly used? How should we look at that as a committee?
Well, as a committee, the first thing to do, which you've heard from everyone about 24 times, is pass comprehensive privacy reform in a bipartisan way, because that gives businesses the rules of the road on how to behave with consumer data. And figuring out how we balance data hygiene, data minimization, and all those questions are going to be part of the hard work that the Senate has to do on this topic. But overall, I would anchor it in the concept of harms. What harm is being done, what's the demonstrable harm, and how do you use the existing law enforcement mechanisms to go after those specific harms? I think it's a lot easier to empower existing law enforcement action than it is to try to create a new one out of whole cloth and hope it works.
I appreciate your thoughts. Thank the panel for being here. Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you so much. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. Appropriate that we're doing this remotely for a tech hearing. And I wanted to, first of all, talk about the fact that AI, and I've said this many times, quoted David Brooks. He says he has a hard time writing about it because he doesn't know if it's going to take us to heaven or hell. And I think there are so many potential incredible benefits coming from the state of the Mayo Clinic that we're going to see here, but we have to put some guardrails in place if we're going to realize those benefits and not have them overwhelmed by potential harm. And I know a lot of the companies involved in this agree. We do have to remember when it comes to privacy, these are no longer just little companies in a garage that resisted any rules for too long. And whether it's competition policy, children's privacy, that we need to put some guardrails in place and it will be better for everyone. So I want to start, Professor Kalo, your testimony discussed how companies can collect or buy vast amounts of a person's non-sensitive information, from what's in their shopping cart to their posts on social media, and use AI to process all that data and make sophisticated inferences about their private health information, such as pregnancy status, whatever, with alarming accuracy. Can you speak to how data minimization can ease the burden on consumers trying to protect their privacy?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, it's a critical issue. So many privacy laws, almost all of them, differentiate between sensitive categories of information, such as health status, and more less sensitive information, even public information. But the problem with these AI systems is that they're extremely good at recognizing patterns in large data sets. And so they can infer sensitive things from, and so how would data minimization help? Well, data minimization would, of course, restrict the overall amount of information and the categories for which it could be used. I think the most effective tool is to define categories of sensitive information to include not just sensitive information itself that's collected from the consumer as sensitive or observed somewhere, but also those sensitive inferences that are derived from AI. I think that's the clearest way. That way, as a corporation, please.
Yeah, very good. Good answer. Thanks. Mr. Tawari, any comments on that? You know that we have demand for data at an all-time high, and will comprehensive privacy legislation perhaps sort of shape what developers and deployers do to adopt more privacy preserving systems as they develop things, which they're already doing? Just quickly.
Thank you, Senator. We very quickly, Mozilla very recently acquired an organization called Anonym. And what Anonym does is it takes privacy-preserving technologies and within trusted execution environments performs the operations that would take place in large distributed systems in a way that nobody can see the data, not the entity that's giving the